What if the most perfect records in rock history were made by two men who fired everyone and then nearly destroyed each other trying? 7 guitarists rejected for a single solo. A $150,000 machine built to replace human drummers. A finished song accidentally erased, lost for 40 years. And a partner communicating from a hospital bed while the album collapsed around him. Becker and Fagen didn't just fire their band. They declared war on human imperfection. This is where that war led. To understand why Steely Dan eventually fired everyone, you had to understand what Walter Becker and Donald Fagen were from the very beginning. They were not rock stars in the traditional sense. They were, by their own admission, aliens. Cranks and wallflowers who found each other at Bard College in New York in the late 1960s. While the rest of the counterculture was busy finding itself, Becker and Fagen were dissecting jazz harmony and trading cynical observations about the American dream. Their music was different from the moment they started writing together. The melodies were sophisticated, the chord changes were dense, jazz-inflected, and deliberately difficult. The lyrics were literate and darkly ironic. Stories of losers, drifters, and dreamers navigating a world that had quietly turned against them. In an era dominated by earnestness and raw emotion, Becker and Fagen were detached observers, as cool and clinical as the music they were beginning to create. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. They arrived in Los Angeles around the turn of the 1970s as staff songwriters, a role for which they were spectacularly ill-suited. Their compositions were simply too harmonically complex for the pop artists of the day. Producer Gary Katz eventually suggested the only way to hear their music performed correctly was to perform it themselves. So, they built a band. Guitarists Denny Dias and Jeff Baxter, drummer Jim Hodder, and vocalist David Palmer joined the lineup that released the debut album Can't Buy a Thrill in 1972. The label had doubted Fagen's voice and worried about his stage fright. Palmer was brought in to handle lead vocals. But even then, from the very first rehearsal, the power flowed in one direction. Becker and Fagen wrote the parts, dictated the vision, and viewed the other members less as creative partners than as instruments in service of their ideas. David Palmer was the first to be phased out. By the time Countdown to Ecstasy arrived in 1973, Fagen had claimed the microphone for himself. The drift away from a traditional band had already begun. Most people just hadn't noticed yet. The moment everything changed arrived in the summer of 1974. After a run of shows that included a performance at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium in early July, Becker and Fagen were done. Not just with the show, with touring, with the road, with the entire concept of being a band. Becker later described the touring experience with characteristic precision, stating it was young, possibly intoxicated performers knocking out what they could remember of some tunes. The disorganized, hit-or-miss nature of 1970s touring was antithetical to everything they cared about. They had been forced to open for heavy metal acts in enormous venues, playing sophisticated music to audiences who mostly wanted volume and chaos. It was, by every measure, a mismatch. Jeff Baxter and Jim Hodder loved the road. They lived for the energy of live performance, for the nightly communion between band and audience. A studio-only existence held no appeal for them. When Becker and Fagen announced they were stopping all touring, Baxter and Hodder walked. And Becker and Fagen didn't replace them. That decision, so simple in execution, so radical in consequence, changed the entire trajectory of American popular music. When they chose not to replace their departed bandmates, they realized something profound. They didn't need a band. They could hire anyone. The entire population of elite session musicians became their palette. Every track could feature the best player alive for that particular song, that particular moment. It was control dressed up as liberation, and for a while, it felt exactly like both. The first album recorded under this new studio-only model was Katy Lied in 1975. The lineup of players read like a dream: bass player Chuck Rainey, guitarist Larry Carlton, drummer Jeff Porcaro. These weren't journeymen. These were the best session musicians in the world, brought in to execute Becker and Fagen's vision with precision. But something went wrong. badly wrong. In their pursuit of a pristine, high-fidelity sound, Becker and Fagen decided to use the then-new DBX noise reduction system during mixing. The technology worked through a process of encoding the audio with a specific frequency curve and decoding it with the exact inverse curve during playback. In theory, it offered dramatically cleaner sound. In practice, it became a nightmare. A fault in the DBX system caused unpredictable distortion in the encoding curve. When Becker and Fagen sat down to mix the album, what they heard was dull and lifeless. The sound they wanted was gone. Becker and Fagen were so dissatisfied that they reportedly refused to listen to the finished album. Katy Lied became a critical success anyway. Audiences loved it. But the men who made it heard only the ghost of what it was supposed to be. The lesson they drew wasn't to slow down. It was to control more, to push harder, to eliminate every possible variable. The gremlin in the machine had only made the machine more demanding. By 1977, Steely Dan had become something no rock band had ever quite been before, an audiophile gold standard. When hi-fi enthusiasts wanted to test a new amplifier or a pair of high-end speakers, they didn't reach for the Rolling Stones. They reached for Steely Dan. The album Aja wasn't just music, it was a reference recording, a benchmark for what was technically possible in a studio environment. Engineer Roger Nichols described the Aja sessions as the musical Olympics. Becker and Fagen brought in the best musicians in the world, players who were the first call for every major artist in the business, and pushed them to their absolute limits. Musicians played the same passages for hours, sometimes days, as the duo searched for a specific feel that was often difficult to articulate. This wasn't simply about playing in time. It was about the microdynamics of a performance, the precise weight of a snare hit, the exact decay of a guitar chord, the subtle interaction between two players that couldn't be rehearsed into existence. The most famous story from those sessions involved the guitar solo for the song Peg. Becker and Fagen were searching for a sound that blended blues vocabulary with the sophisticated chord changes beneath the track. They brought in guitarist after guitarist, Robin Ford, Larry Carlton, Rick Derringer. Each one was rejected. The feel was wrong. The blend was off. The articulation didn't match the internal vision that existed somewhere in Fagen's head. At least 7 world-class guitarists came and went before Jay Graydon walked in. Graydon spent 5 full hours dialing in his gear before playing a single note. When Fagen told him to think blues over the chord changes, Graydon found the combination of double stops and string bends that finally delivered what the track needed. He left the studio that night not knowing if he had made the record. He found out weeks later when he heard himself on the radio. The title track featured a legendary drum performance from Steve Gadd, reportedly captured in 1 or 2 takes, and became a rare flash of spontaneous brilliance in an otherwise meticulously engineered album. Aja won the Grammy for Best Engineered Recording and sold millions of copies. It was the apex of everything the studio-only model had promised, and it pushed Becker and Fagen further toward the edge they were already approaching. Following the triumph of Aja, expectations for the follow-up were enormous. But as the sessions for Gaucho began in New York in 1978, something was different. The perfectionism that had produced Aja hadn't softened in victory. It had intensified. What had once felt like disciplined craftsmanship was mutating into something more obsessive and ultimately more destructive. The sessions lasted over 2 years. 42 different musicians cycled through the studio. Of those 42, only 17 appeared on the final 7-track album. The rest had been found wanting, not for lack of talent, but for failing to deliver the exact feel, the exact weight, the exact precision that Becker and Fagen demanded. Mark Knopfler, who played guitar on Time Out of Mind, and was at that point one of the most celebrated guitarists on the planet, later described the experience as getting into a swimming pool with lead weights tied to your boots. Musicians played the same passages for hours, while the duo searched for something they sometimes couldn't even name. The human element of performance, the spontaneity, the slight imperfections that gave music its life, was no longer an asset. It had become a liability. And then the personal catastrophes began. Walter Becker's life outside the studio was unraveling with devastating speed. He had developed a severe addiction to narcotics. In January 1980, his girlfriend, Karen Stanley, died of a drug overdose in his apartment. Her family filed a wrongful death lawsuit, alleging he had introduced her to the lifestyle that killed her. 3 months later, in April 1980, Becker was struck by a taxi in Manhattan, fracturing his leg and leaving him immobile for 6 months. During the final stages of the Gaucho sessions, he communicated with Fagen and the engineers from his hospital bed, unable to be physically present in the room where the album was being made. Meanwhile, a three-way legal dispute erupted between record labels and Steely Dan over album rights. Jazz pianist Keith Jarrett filed a copyright infringement lawsuit, claiming the title track plagiarized his own composition from 1974. The album that was supposed to build on Aja's perfection had become a siege. Fagen carried nearly the entire creative burden alone, managing frustrated session musicians, a spiraling budget, and a partner fighting battles on every front. The studio that had always been their sanctuary had become a pressure chamber, and there was no road to escape to, no live audience to remind them why they had started. They had eliminated that option years ago. Amid the chaos of the Gaucho sessions, Becker and Fagen grew increasingly frustrated with one fundamental problem. Human drummers couldn't maintain the mechanical precision they demanded with absolute consistency. Even the best players in the world, Steve Gadd, Rick Marotta, Bernard Purdie, had moments where the beat shifted by milliseconds in ways that Becker and Fagen could hear and couldn't accept. So they went to engineer Roger Nichols. They told him they wished they had a machine that could play exact beats with full-frequency drum sounds and allow them to move the kick and snare completely independently. Nichols, a former nuclear physicist, listened and told them he could build exactly what they were describing for $150,000. They said yes. Nichols was given a budget and 6 weeks. What he produced was called Wendel, one of the very first digital drum samplers. Unlike the crude drum machines of the era, which used synthesized white noise to approximate drum sounds, Wendel used 12-bit digital samples of actual drums recorded by Nichols himself. The programming was extraordinarily labor-intensive. Nichols coded the machine in assembly language, typing long strings of hexadecimal numbers for 20 minutes just to produce a single snare hit. But Wendel delivered what no human drummer could guarantee: total consistency. The basic rhythm tracks on songs like Hey 19, Glamour Profession, and My Rival were built from Wendel's sampled drums, with human drummers receiving credit for fills and embellishments layered on top. The foundation, the heartbeat of the song, was a machine.
Hey 19, that's Otis Red.
Wendel eventually received its own platinum record. It remains the only computer in history to be so honored. Becker and Fagen later called this development the birth of the cruel. They had pioneered sampled, sequenced music that would eventually reshape the entire recording industry. In 1979, it simply felt like the only way to get the record done. Of all the disasters that define the Gaucho era, none was more painful than what happened to the second arrangement. The song was the centerpiece of the album. Everyone in the studio knew it. A classic Steely Dan narrative about a gentleman loser navigating a divorce and rebuilding his life. The track bridged the warmth of Aja with the cool precision of Gaucho in a way that nothing else on the record quite achieved. It was nearly finished. It only needed a horn arrangement and a final mix. In the language of the studio, it was a lock. A junior engineer was tasked with preparing the master tape for the horn session. Through a mistake that was never fully explained, he recorded silence over the track. The master tape was gone. By the time anyone realized what had happened, only 25% of the song remained. When Donald Fagen was told what had occurred, he walked out of the studio in total silence. They tried to re-record the song multiple times. Steve Gadd was brought in to play drums on the new recordings. Every attempt failed. What emerged from those sessions was, in the words of the musicians who heard both versions, nowhere close to what had been lost. Eventually, Becker and Fagen abandoned it entirely, replacing it on the album with Third World Man, an outtake from the Katy Lied sessions, reworked with new lyrics. For decades, the second arrangement existed only as a low-quality bootleg cassette, passed among fans like a relic, proof that something extraordinary had once existed and then vanished. Then, in 2020, Cimsy Nichols, daughter of engineer Roger Nichols, discovered a cassette and a tape among her late father's belongings. They contained a rough mix recorded the night before the erasure, preserved because Roger Nichols had a habit of taking home mixes after every session. He had unwittingly preserved the song that everyone believed was lost forever. After years of careful restoration, high-quality versions of the track surfaced online in June 2023. The fan community greeted them with something close to euphoria. A wound that had been open for 40 years had finally, quietly, healed. Gaucho was released in November 1980. It went platinum. It won the Grammy for Best Engineered Recording. By every commercial and critical measure, it was a success. Becker and Fagen didn't feel successful. They felt exhausted and hollowed out. Fagen described a feeling of ennui and depression so deep that continuing felt impossible. Becker, still recovering physically and personally from the disasters of the previous 2 years, had already begun withdrawing from the partnership. The process of making Gaucho had been, in Becker's own word, an agony. They had pushed the studio-only method to its ultimate conclusion and found not satisfaction, but emptiness. In 1981, the partnership quietly dissolved. There was no dramatic public announcement, no press release, no final concert. Becker moved to Hawaii, joking that he planned to become an avocado rancher, and soon turned to producing other artists. Fagen retreated to solo work, releasing The Nightfly in 1982, an album many fans consider the purest expression of the Steely Dan sensibility, made without the crushing weight of the Gaucho era. The silence lasted over a decade. Becker and Fagen reunited in 1993 for a tour that would have been unthinkable in their earlier years. Live performance, the thing they had walked away from in 1974, turned out to be survivable after all. The touring industry had transformed into something more professionally organized, more logistically precise. It suited them better than it once had. They made 2 more studio albums. Two Against Nature in 2000, won 4 Grammy Awards in 2001, including Album of the Year, a remarkable vindication for a band that had spent nearly a decade in silence. But for the generation of listeners who grew up with Aja on the turntable and reelin' in the years on FM radio, the classic era, 1972 through 1980, remained the definitive chapter. That was the period when Becker and Fagen had tried to remove every human imperfection from recorded music. In doing so, they produced some of the most enduring music the decade ever heard, and eventually broke themselves trying. Walter Becker passed away in 2017, bringing the partnership to its final close. What he and Fagen had built together remained, perfectly preserved in vinyl and tape and digital restoration, proof that the pursuit of perfection, taken far enough, becomes its own kind of destruction. Steely Dan didn't fall apart from drugs or ego or a fistfight in a hotel room. They fell apart from too much ambition aimed too precisely at something that didn't exist. The perfect record, the perfect take, the perfect machine. They got closer than anyone before them. But the cost was the band, the partnership, and eventually, each other. What part of this story hit you hardest? Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from rock's greatest era.